And in there, she explores how our brains and minds are heavily influenced by early age interactions with external environment. Her highly praised book, The Philosophical Baby, was featured in numerous readings. Among them are San Francisco Chronicle bestseller and New York Times editor's choice. And she also started to write a science column at the Wall Street Journal, starting today. And she will today she will be taking us on a journey into children's cognition and how their open-mindedness and scientists in their early years can have such profound and everlasting impact. And it is with great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Alison Gopnik.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm so pleased at I'm so pleased about the Berkeley students organizing this. Seems like a really classic, wonderful, only in Berkeley event. Okay. First of all, we need to turn these on. That's muted. Okay. And do we need to lower the lights to get the?
Yeah.
Okay. Better? It's a little dark. Okay, I thought that picture is worth looking at. That's actually a baby who's reading my book, The Philosophical Baby, or at least eating my book, The Philosophical Baby. Now, for some 2,000 years, if you'd asked most philosophers and psychologists and psychiatrists about babies, if you'd asked most philosophers about babies, they would have basically acted as if babies didn't exist. In fact, I did an analysis of the 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and in the 2,000 pages of that volume, there are 4 references to babies, children, mothers, fathers. You could read the whole book and think that human beings reproduced by asexual cloning, which may have been true of philosophers in the past, but doesn't seem to really reflect the significance and importance of babies and young children in our everyday life, nor the increasingly clear significance of babies and young children for cognitive science. Now, if you'd asked those philosophers and psychologists and psychiatrists even 30 years ago about babies and children's minds, they would have said that babies and young children were egocentric, amoral, acausal, illogical, unable to take the perspective of other people, restricted to the here and now. And even the great founder of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, didn't think very much of babies' minds from that perspective. Now, over the last 30 years or so, new techniques have completely reversed that picture. So we've discovered that even the very youngest babies both know more and learn more than we ever would have thought was possible before. And understanding that early knowledge and that early learning has really changed our perspective on how human beings think and learn in general. Now, I actually started out my career as a philosopher, and I'm still an affiliate in the philosophy department. And one of the great philosophical questions is, how is it ever possible for us to know as much as we do about the world around us? After all, we live in a world of chairs and tables and people, and for that matter, distant planets and quarks and leptons. And yet all that ever reaches us from that world are a bunch of disturbances of air at our eardrums and photons hitting the back of our retinas. How could we ever get from that very, very limited information to our really amazing knowledge of the world around us? That's always been a really profound philosophical question. And what I thought all the way back as an undergraduate like you was that maybe one way to answer that question was to actually look at the people who are really experiencing that, who are really doing the learning, namely babies and young children. And that's really what I've devoted the rest of my career to doing. So here's a question about babies and young children that is an interesting one that philosophers haven't asked or thought about very much, which is, why is it that we have children at all? Not the proximal reason, which all of us in the audience here probably know about, but why, from an evolutionary perspective, would we have this long period of childhood in which babies are so dependent on the adults around them? Because if you think about it, babies are basically useless. They don't bring in any money, they don't take care of things, and in fact, arguably, they're worse than useless because we adults have to put so much time and energy into just keeping them alive. And it feels like that's an evolutionary paradox. When you actually look at evolutionary psychology more broadly, the paradox actually gets worse instead of better. Often when people talk about evolutionary psychology explanations for things, they basically mean a kind of just so story where you say, yeah, it would have been better from an evolutionary perspective for X to be true. If you really want to make an evolutionary argument, you need to look at lots more species than just human beings. And in fact, in this case, we do know about a lot more species than just human beings. And the results of that suggest an interesting resolution to this evolutionary paradox. Because what we find when we look across many different species is essentially that the longer the childhood, the smarter the adult animal is. And this idea actually first started not even with mammals, but with birds. The sort of poster child for the poster animal for this relationship. On this side, this is a New Caledonian crow. These are crows who live off the coast of New Zealand. And crows and corvids and rooks and related animals are all incredibly smart birds. And this is actually a New Caledonian crow who's learned how to bend a wire to pull that tube up to get food. On the other hand, here is our friend the domestic chicken, and ducks and chickens and also ducks and geese and turkey are basically as dumb as stumps. So they're very, very good at pecking for grain. They're not very good at doing very much of anything else. And the crow babies are actually fledglings for as long as a year, and the New Caledonian crow babies are actually fledglings for as long as 2 years, and recent studies have shown. Whereas the chicken babies are mature within a couple of weeks or months. So this relationship not only holds for us, it holds for other mammals, it holds for exotic marsupial animals in Australia in a recent study, it holds for birds. So there seems to be this very general relationship between how smart the adult animal is and how long a period of childhood the babies have, how useless and helpless the babies are. And of course, we're way off on the end of the distribution on all of these measures. So we have by far the largest brain relative to our body. We are the most flexible. We rely the most on learning. And our babies are helpless and useless until, well, my son is 23. So at least until they're 23. Again, with apologies to the incredibly competent people under the age of 30 in this room, I suspect that many of you are still being fed worms by somebody who's at home. So we're still feeding worms to our children even when they're in their 20s. Why would that be? Why would you see this relationship? Well, there's different ideas, but a kind of obvious thought is that some animals, like the chickens, are beautifully adapted to do particular things very well in one environment. They're very, very, very good at pecking grain. Other animals, like the crows, and especially we humans, aren't so well designed at doing any one particular thing, but we're very good at learning what to do in new environments. And there's a lot of evidence that the particular ecological trigger for our evolution was an increase in variability in the environment. It's not so much the environment got drier or wetter or hotter or colder, but it got more variable, more unpredictable. And what learning strategy seems to do is to enable you to deal with new environments and unpredictable environments. So you can plunk us in a brand new environment and we'll learn how to deal with that environment. And that strategy has a lot of advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. And of course, the disadvantage is that until you actually do that learning, you're going to be helpless. So you don't want to have the mastodon actually be charging at you and be saying to yourself, a mastodon, I wonder if a slingshot would work for this, or, maybe a spear would be more effective. You want to have actually learned all that before you're actually facing the reality of the environment that you find yourself in. And the idea is that childhood is actually evolution's way of solving that problem. There's a kind of division of labor where we have this early period where all we have to do is learn, and then we have a later period where we can take what we learned as as children and put it to use to do all of the many things that we need to do as adults. Interestingly, there's a paper that just came out about the New Caledonian crows. Actually, it was the subject of my first Wall Street Journal column a couple of weeks ago. And if you read this paper, especially if you can see the videos that are associated with it, it's sort of amazing because when you see those baby fledglings for those 2 years, they are just being totally incompetent. They spend those 2 years picking up the sticks by the wrong end, jamming them. These in the wild, the animals, you learn how to use sticks to get insects, and they're just pathetically useless at doing this for a year and a half. And the mama crows are sort of standing there patiently looking and waiting for them to get their act together, and occasionally dropping a worm in at the same time. Again, not any references to any parents of anybody in this audience. So that seems to be the evolutionary story. So the evolutionary picture is there's this kind of division of labor. One way I like to think of it is you could think about babies and children as being like the R&D division of the human species. They're the ones who just get to explore and learn and consider lots of possibilities, and we adults are production and marketing. So we're the ones who have to take those discoveries and actually put them to use to do things out there in the world. Now, if this picture about the difference between childhood and adulthood is correct, then you might expect to see some signs of it in the brains of adults and children. And in fact, you do. This is actually an old classic slide showing the number of connections, synapses in the brain through development. And what you can see is that there's an early period when many, many, many new connections are being formed. And then there's a later period when the connections that are used a lot are maintained, and then many connections are actually pruned. They're actually abandoned. So what you have in the brain is an early system that's extremely flexible, extremely plastic, as neuroscientists say. Very, very good at changing, at learning, at doing new things in the light of the environment. Not very efficient or effective. Not very good at doing things quickly. Not very good at doing things efficiently. And then you have a later system which is much better at actually getting things done. It's highly myelinated, it's effective, it's efficient, but much less good at actually changing in the light of new experience. Much less plastic, much less flexible. So you seem to see this kind of division of labor even in the brain itself. And one thing that is perhaps a slightly idiosyncratic view of mine, but I think still interesting, is that that was actually the subject of my third column for the Wall Street Journal. Is if you look at the prefrontal area of the brain, sort of the executive center of the brain, the part responsible for doing things like inhibiting impulses and focusing attention, that part of the brain is actually the latest part of the brain to mature, and it isn't completely wired until well into the 20s. Now, that part of the brain, the prefrontal particular regions within the prefrontal area and the abilities that are associated with it, often called executive function abilities, have gotten a very strong press. So people generally are all about how wonderful executive function is. And if you're one of those adult creatures, it is wonderful. It's really great to actually be able to tie your shoes and cross the street by yourself and do all the things that we can do as adults. But if you think about a system that's really just designed for exploration, a system that's designed to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible, it may be that actually having less prefrontal control is an advantage from that perspective. And there are some recent studies which suggest that when you look at something like a creativity task, say jazz musicians who have to improvise, that actually you have inhibition of frontal areas in that case, and that experimentally inhibiting frontal areas leads people to do worse on tasks that require focus, but may lead them to do better on tasks that involve creativity or innovation. So that's a little cautionary note, because there's a lot of attempts now to really push more and more executive control in babies and children earlier and earlier, and I think there may be some interesting cost to that. Okay, so if you wanted to do all of cognitive science sort of in one tweet, you'd say cognitive science is about the way that about the idea that the brain is a computational system shaped by evolution and instantiated in brains. So we've talked about evolution in brains. What about the computational piece? And the computational piece is really where my work comes in. This is where I've been toiling for the last 10 or 15 years. And what we've discovered over the last 10 or 15 years is that the way that babies can learn so much so quickly is by using some very powerful inductive algorithms, some very powerful learning mechanisms. And in particular, they seem to be using the same kinds of learning mechanisms that have become very popular in machine learning and computer science over the past 10 or 15 years. And these are ideas that began with the Reverend Bayes there. You can see that Bayes and the baby even have sort of the same haircut and facial expression. And essentially what Bayes did was to have a kind of calculus of probability. So Bayes, am I hearing that this is not loud enough? I can't seem to turn this up, but can everybody hear? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So what Bayes did was provide a kind of inductive calculus using probability, a way that you could actually use probability in statistics to figure out things about the structure of the world. So if you really want to know what's going on inside of the minds of these babies, I think it looks something like this. That's actually the page from Bayes' notebook where he first articulated Bayes' rule. And in fact, in collaboration with other cognitive scientists at Berkeley, we've been able to articulate exactly the kinds of learning principles and algorithms that these very young babies are using. And rather remarkably, it turns out that when we actually go out and test, the babies seem to be using much more sophisticated principles for things like causal inference or statistical reasoning than we ever would have thought before. Now, when I say when you go out and test, now of course, and perhaps fortunately for us developmental psychologists, anyone who's taught or taken a statistics course knows that even adults have a great deal of difficulty understanding things like statistics and probability. My friend and colleague, ex-Berkeley, Danny Kahneman, got a Nobel Prize for showing how bad adults are at doing this. But when we ask adults these questions, what we do is we explicitly talk to them about probability. And I think it may be an advantage of developmental psychology that we can't actually go out and ask a 4-year-old, what do you think the probability of X is? Or what do you think the relationship is between conditional dependence and causal structure, right? We wouldn't get anything at all out of that. So how is it that we can find out that children know and learn so much? And this goes back to what I was saying to begin with about this great revolution in developmental psychology in the last 30 years. And it's come because we've figured out how to ask children questions in their language instead of in our language, and to get them to tell us answers in their language instead of in our language. So what we did to do this is to design a very simple little device called the Blicket Detector. And the Blicket Detector is a box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it and not other things. It probably costs $29.99. It would take very, very little money from the central budget to fund our studies in perpetuity. We have low equipment costs. But with that very simple little device, so the way it actually works is that there's a graduate student who's behind a curtain who's pressing a button to make it go or not. But fortunately, the children don't ever figure that out. So what we can do is we can use this very simple device and similar devices to show children patterns of evidence, show them something about how the machine works, and then see what kinds of inferences they make show children patterns of evidence about when the machine lights up and when it doesn't, and how it's associated with some blocks versus others. And then we can just ask the children, can you make it go, and see what they've learned about the causal structure of the machine. So this is, in some ways, the most basic, fundamental thing that we do in science, is to take statistical patterns of evidence and infer causal structure from it. That's what we all do as scientists. And what we've been trying to do is to see if even very little babies can do the same thing. And I realized that lots of you here have seen the TED Talk, my TED Talk. For those of you who haven't, so I decided not to actually show the beautiful video of the little boy doing this. For those of you who haven't, just skip through me blithering on, and after about a minute, you'll see a wonderful video of a child playing with his Blicket detector. But here's an example of one of the experiments that we've done with a Blicket detector to try to test this general idea that children are using Bayesian principles to try to figure out how the world works. The fundamental idea behind Bayesian inference is that you start out with some assumptions or some knowledge or some ideas about how the world works, which in the Bayesian framework is called your prior hypotheses. You start out thinking that some hypotheses are more likely than other hypotheses. And then what happens is you look at a bunch of data, and when you look at the data, you can combine the data, the probability of that data given your hypothesis with the initial probability of your hypothesis, and then you can revise and change your ideas about which hypothesis is most likely. And there's a bunch of math to do this that I won't go into. Maybe we can talk about it later on. So with a Blicket detector, first we started out by just asking the children, how do you think it goes? And when we did that, all the children, just like adults, put a block on the detector rather than, say, waving it on top of the detector. So to begin with, initially, there's a higher prior likelihood for the block making contact, the block activating it by making contact than the block activating it by not making contact. And there's a whole long literature in psychology suggesting this. So then what we did was we actually showed the children patterns of evidence. So what we showed them was the red block makes the machine go 2 out of 3 times, but it makes the machine go without actually making contact. The blue block, in contrast, makes the machine go 2 out of 6 times, but it actually makes contact with the machine. So if the children are simply going on their prior hypothesis, and then we simply say to them, make it go. So if they're going with their initial hypothesis, they should use the blue block to make it go. But if they're actually integrating that with the evidence, then they should use the red block. And in fact, what we found is that 3- and 4-year-olds would wave the red block on top when they had a choice of making it go rather than make contact with the blue block. In fact, interestingly, their responses were exactly in accordance with the probability of the red block or the blue block making it go. That might just be a coincidence here, but we've actually done a bunch of recent studies that show that this is true more generally. So if you show the children, say, that there's a 70% chance of one hypothesis being true and a 30% chance of the other hypothesis, they'll guess the first one 70% of the time and the second one 30% of the time, even though if you ask them about probability, they have no idea what it is that you're talking about. And in an experiment that we just submitted today, I hope, we've shown that even 24-month-olds can understand probabilities in this way. Now remember, these are 3- and 4-year-olds, so they're just starting to add and subtract. Nevertheless, notice that even though in both cases there are 2 examples of the block activating the machine, if you were doing the math to figure out the probability of the block activating the machine, you'd realize that 2 divided by 6 is actually a lower probability than 2 divided by 3, and you'd conclude that the blue block was actually more probable. And that's just what the children do. Okay, so far I've been talking about children using statistics as a way of figuring out how physical systems like the blocks work, but it's equally important, perhaps even more important, to understand how other people's minds work, understand how the people around us work. And way back in the 90s, when I first got here, I was one of the people who first started to do work in what's come to be a whole field called theory of mind, understanding what's going on in somebody else's mind. And theory of mind is a good example where the traditional wisdom was that children, say, couldn't take the perspective of another person until well into the school-age years. But we thought maybe we just weren't asking the question the right way. So in this experiment, my graduate student, Betty Rapicoli, and I gave children 2 bowls of food, 1 bowl of raw broccoli, and 1 bowl of Pepperidge Farm goldfish crackers. And all of the children, even in Berkeley, like the crackers more than they liked the raw broccoli. Then the experimenter would take a little taste of food from each bowl, and either she'd make a happy face, so she'd go, broccoli, or she'd make a disgusted face and she'd go, oh, yuck, broccoli. And then she would give the child the bowls, put her hand out and say, can you give me some? The question was, what would the children give her? Would they give her what she liked, namely, in the case where she liked the broccoli, or would they give her what they liked, which was the crackers. And what we discovered was that 18-month-old children, just barely walking and talking, already would give her the broccoli if she liked the broccoli and the crackers if she liked the crackers. So they already seem to have understood this fairly deep thing about other people, which is that sometimes they want things that are different from you. And interestingly, in the light of a lot of recent work about children having early understandings of morality, they also thought that if someone wanted something, you should help them to get what they wanted, not just necessarily what you thought would be best. The 15-month-olds, on the other hand, didn't do this. The 15-month-olds always gave her the crackers, whether she liked the broccoli or whether she liked the crackers. They had longer response times. They sort of stared at her when she acted as if she liked the broccoli, but they didn't seem to have made this leap of figuring out that her response could be different. Okay, so this suggested that not only is it sort of amazing that the 18-month-olds know it, but in a way it's even more amazing that they seem to have learned it between the ages of 15 and 18 months. How could they be learning it? Well, once again, now my graduate student and colleague, Fei Xu, thought that maybe the children were using some of these things about statistical patterns as a way of understanding how it was that children, what kinds of desires other people had. And in particular, we thought maybe children were using some ideas about the relationship between a sample and a population, one of the really basic ideas that we all learn in intro statistics. So how could we ask 20-month-old babies whether they understood the relationship between a sample and a population? So here's what Tamar and Henry did.
Wow, frogs!
So they showed the 20-month-olds a box like this. So what they did was show Sam that the experimenter only picked the frogs out of that whole group of mixed objects. And from the statistical perspective, although it's possible that she did that randomly, it's very unlikely that she did it randomly. Okay, so what he saw was, this is another excuse to do cute baby videos. You can see how bright-eyed and focused babies are in these tests. But all right, so what he saw this pattern of responses, the experimenter picking out the frogs 4 times, which was possible, but very improbable. So it's a little bit as if the baby's saying to himself, less than 0.05 probability that this was the result of chance. There must be some underlying causal factor here. The likeliest causal factor is that she really likes the frogs. And then when the baby has the choice to give her the frogs or the ducks, he only just gives her the frogs. He seems to recognize that. Now, you might wonder, well, is it really that he understood the relationship between the sample and population? Maybe it was just that he was focusing on the frogs. So they did this nice control condition.
Wow, frogs! Look at all these frogs! Hey, Sydney,
Now, think about the statistics now, right? There's nothing to do except pull out frogs. So even if she was acting completely randomly, she would pick out 4 frogs. So statistically, that doesn't tell you anything about her preferences because she picked out the frogs from a population that only consisted of frogs.
Sydney! Oh, goody, just what I wanted! Can you give me one? Can you give me one? Michelle, thank you. Michelle, thank you. Good job. Good job.
Okay, so what you can see is that in that case, the statistical evidence, even though what the experimenter did was exactly the same, she did exactly the same thing. But if you were trying to do a statistical analysis of what she did, in that case you'd say, I have no evidence that she actually prefers ducks to frogs. So when she comes in, I'm going to just half the time give her frogs and half the time give her ducks, which was exactly what the 20-month-olds did in that condition. So not only is it amazing that the babies this age were able to infer what the other person wanted, but they were actually using statistics in this very sophisticated way to try to make that inference, to try and figure it out. And in experiments that we're doing in the lab right at the moment, we're actually, I think, showing that if you take 15-month-olds who can't solve this problem and then train them by giving them lots of this kind of data about preferences, then we see them switch to having the more sophisticated general understanding. Okay, so far I've been talking about fairly specific kinds of causal relationships that the children are inferring. And again, I think what we've shown is that kids are just staggeringly good at doing this, very, very, very impressively good and sophisticated at doing this. The next experiment, as is so often the case, the next experiment, we started out just looking for one thing, and then we found something else that was actually more interesting maybe than what we were originally looking for. What we started out trying to figure out was whether children could actually infer more abstract laws about causal relationships. So for example, in the Blicket detector, one thing you could try to infer is whether this one the red one will make it go, or the blue one won't, or whether holding it up will make it go, or making contact with it will make it go. But there could also be some more general principles about how the detector just sort of works in general, and you might be trying to infer those as well. So we started out trying to see if the kids could use the Blicket detector, in a Blicket detector paradigm, they could actually infer a more abstract principle. And here's how the experiment went. You guys can all do the experiment. The children saw D, a particular Blicket, go on the detector. So D and E and F are all, for the kids, they're all different shaped objects, different shaped and colored objects. So they see D go on 3 times, they see E go on once, then they see D and F go on together, and then they see D and F go on together and the Blicket activates. So here's the question. Is D a Blicket? Okay. Is E a Blicket? Is F a Blicket? Okay. Great. You guys are just as smart as the undergraduates, the other undergraduates at Berkeley. Not quite so swift as the 4-year-olds. Because what if you also first saw this sequence of events? So A goes on the detector, nothing happens. B goes on and nothing happens. C goes on and nothing happens. And then A and B together go on, A and C together go on, and B and C together go on. Do I have the... all right, now what do you think about which one is a Blicket? So is A a Blicket? You sure? Oh, okay. Well, actually, if you saw these events first, right? These events only make sense if combinations of Blickets are actually the things that make the machine go, not individual Blickets, right? So what really seems to be happening here is, you have to have both A and C together in order to make the machine go. And if you saw this sequence of events first and then went back to that previous sequence of events, you might say, you know what, maybe D is obligate. Maybe it's just that the abstract rule is this combination rule where you need to have D and F to make the machine go. So what we did was we just did exactly what I just described to you. We gave children and Berkeley undergraduates, in fact, exactly the same task. And what happened was, in one condition, they had what we called OR training. In other words, information that showed you that the machine worked according to this OR principle, that either a block made it go or it didn't make it go. So in the OR training, you saw that A makes it go and C makes it go, B doesn't, and then A and B together don't make it go, A and C, and B and C make it go. So that should be telling you that, okay, A is obligate and C is obligate, but B isn't. But then in the other condition, we actually had this AND training that I just showed you. And that should make you start thinking about the hypothesis, the possibility that really it's a different principle. It's not just that each individual block makes it go, but you need combinations of blocks to make it go. And one thing that we know from a long adult literature is that most people, like you, assume the OR relationship. So that's kind of the default condition for adults when they're thinking about how a system like this works, is that it must work with these individual hypotheses. But of course it could work in this kind of conjunctive way. And then what we did in the test was, again, we did exactly what we did with you. We just asked whether you thought the D and E or D and F were obligate. And in a version of this that we've just submitted, we did something else. We actually then asked the subjects to make the machine go. So then we just showed them the machine, we showed them an array of these blocks, and we just said, make it go. And we did this with exactly the same experiment with Berkeley undergraduates and with 4-year-olds. And here's the result. So in the OR case, when the actual structure was the OR case, that's the one on that side, both the children and the adults very sensibly and intelligently thought that the OR principle was the right principle. So this is their choices about which one is obligate. And in fact, when we asked the children in the OR case, again, very straightforwardly and sensibly to make the machine go, they would pick up an individual block and put it on to make the machine go. In the AND case, however, we saw a really interesting difference. The adults continued to act as if the machine worked on the OR principle, even though they had data that it didn't. Whereas the children were actually sensitive to the data. So the children were willing to switch, to change their minds, to think of a new possibility in a way that the adults weren't. And the same thing happened when we asked the children and adults to make the machine go. What the children did was to take combinations of blocks and put them on the machine, even combinations of new blocks. They'd worked out this abstract principle that this is a combination machine, and the adults just kept on putting on individual blocks the way that they had at the beginning of the experiment. So it seems that the children are actually better at getting to this unlikely hypothesis than the adults are. Actually, there was just a piece about this experiment in the Times Science column last week. And it was kind of, I think the reason why it was there was because David Dobbs, who's the very bright science reporter for the Times, actually came to my lab and sat in on this experiment. And he was shocked because this 4-year-old actually got it right and he didn't. He was sitting there watching it, trying to figure out what was going on, and got it completely wrong, and the 4-year-old got it right. And I think this had such an emotional effect on him that he decided to write a piece about it. Now, this actually might make some sense if you think about that evolutionary picture that I was starting to talk about at the beginning of the talk. So if you think that there's this, so in computer science and in machine learning, people talk about a trade-off between explore strategies and exploit strategies. So from a Bayesian perspective, one way you can think about learning is that you have a space of hypotheses. You have all these different hypotheses that you could have about the world. And learning is really about trying to decide the probability of all those hypotheses. Now, you can't look at all those hypotheses at once, so what you have to do is to do what's called sampling. You have to pick some hypotheses and test them. And there's different ways that you can do it. One way you could do it is you could start out from the hypothesis that you think is very likely to be true, a very high probability hypothesis, and you could just sort of search around there. That's a kind of exploit strategy. That's most likely to get you a pretty good answer really quickly. Alternatively, what you could do is you could go and bounce around and look at much more of the space. You could try out some of the things that at first seem very, very, very unlikely, not very likely to be true at all. And you could see what happens when you actually test and try out those hypotheses. That strategy is much less likely to be effective. That's an explore strategy. It's much less likely to be effective in the short run, right? You're more likely to end up with something that doesn't work than something that does work. But sometimes the unlikely thing turns out to be just the thing that really does work. And that's the reason why human beings have been able to make all this fantastic scientific and technological innovation, is by considering that really, really weird, odd, strange idea that nobody else thought of. Now, when you look out in the machine learning literature, the way they solve this tension between what should you do? Should you explore or should you exploit? There's trade-offs between the two of them. In the machine learning literature, the way they solve that problem is to do something called simulated annealing. And the idea in simulated annealing is that you start the system out with what's called a very high temperature search, bouncing around, looking at all sorts of hypotheses, not ever staying very well with one, going off and trying weird, strange things. And if you have a kind of creature or a system that's doing this, it might look kind of irrational. It's bouncing around from one idea to the next. It doesn't look like it's doing anything very systematic or logical. And then as the system goes on, it cools off and it starts searching in a much narrower way. And when you do that, that seems to be the way of trading off, not missing interesting, innovative, low probability ideas, but still not spending all your time, wasting your time looking at things that are never going to actually pay off. And my motto at the moment, what we're exploring in my lab, is the idea that childhood is basically evolution's way of performing simulated annealing. So we have this long protected period when we don't actually have to do anything, when we're being taken care of. And that means that we can try out all sorts of wild, crazy, strange, irrational ideas, the kind of thing that you see when you see when you have a conversation with a typical 3-year-old that seems to bounce around from one thing to another. But it's because we have that early protected period that we can actually, as adults, make the kind of innovative advances that we can and do the kinds of things that we do. So let me end there. The final thing to say is just that I hope I've convinced you that aside from the other reasons for paying attention to the fact that we don't reproduce by asexual cloning, actually paying attention to babies and young children who've been frankly sort of dismissed throughout most of intellectual history. They're kind of the kind of stuff that women are interested in, might actually help us to solve some of these big, profound philosophical and psychological and computational questions. So maybe we have some time for that.